All right, everyone. Go ahead and take your seats and we'll get started. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here tonight for our Science on Tap. My name is Cinnamon Moffett. I'm the Associate Director of Marine Research Support, and I'll be one of your hosts. I'll introduce the other host here in just a second. But I want to thank you all for being here on this day and joining us for this talk. This is a hybrid event, so I see some new faces in the room, so just a couple of logistics here. For our hybrid event, we have folks online and folks in the room. For folks online, we have a volunteer, Roseanne, here. Hi, Roseanne. Who will help navigate all of your questions. If you have any trouble hearing us, just let us know so we don't keep talking and you can't hear us. She'll also help navigate any questions for today's speaker. So just put those questions into the chat box. We have disabled your cameras and your mic share, so use that chat box to talk with us. For folks in the room, you'll just need to raise your hand when we get to question and answer. And our other host, who I'll introduce in a second, again, will run around with a mic and make sure that those folks online can hear us. But again, thank you so much for being here. I have a couple of really quick announcements and then we're going to get rolling. So my favorite one is what's going to happen very, very soon, is that Hatfield is hosting our public outreach event on April 11th. We open our doors and we bring in the public, and we basically do an adult science fair for kiddos. But all of our researchers put out tables with all sorts of interactive things. Lifetime learners are also invited to come. It's a really great day. So if you happen to be around in Newport on April 11th, this is a free event. Goes from 10 to 3, and there is so much stuff to do, you probably can't do it all in one day. So hopefully, if you've even been here before, come back. It's a really, really great event. So I invite you to come join us for Marine Science Day, April 11th. I also wanted to promote, running around a little bit already. I wanted to promote next month's Science on Tap. We do these events every single month during the academic year. So our next one is April 15th. Will White, who is an associate professor with Coombs here at Hatfield, is going to be talking about coastal climate change resilience and whether there's local solutions to this global problem. So I think that's going to be a really interesting conversation with Will, so I invite you to come on back. That'll be April 15th, same time, so 6 to 7. Come on back to us. If you're interested in any of the Hatfield events, if you go to the Hatfield webpage, go to the events page, everything is there for you to join us either in person or online. And it's also where you can find recordings of these events. So this particular event will be recorded. For those folks that weren't able to join us today, feel free to share it. It'll be posted hopefully by tomorrow afternoon. But the reason you're all here is for our speaker. And so this particular speaker was invited by our Big Fish Lab, and Taylor Chappell is part of that and is going to introduce today's speaker. And this is part of a collaboration with a big conference that's here in the next couple of days. And so we're very excited to have our speaker here as part of that conference and as part of our Science on Tap. So I'm going to hand the mic off.
Thank you, Cinnamon. Yeah, I thought you were going to stay up here with me. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm Taylor Chappell. I'm the co-director of one of the co-directors of the Big Fish Lab. And we are incredibly excited today to host Dr. Isla Hodgson. She is a conservation, let's see if I can do this, conservation, political and social scientist. It's close, right? Isla is coming here from Scotland, flew all the way over to Scotland just to spend this time with us. And she's going to be talking about the work that Isla does is on the sort of the forefront of conservation conflict management is what she's going to talk about today. So things, she's done topics, things like seals and salmon, terrestrial things, game birds, birds of prey and game birds. Okay. And so she's going to be talking about some of the marine work that, well, hopefully, I'm assuming some of the marine work that she's been doing in basking sharks and other species. Isla did all of her degrees, her undergrad, her master's, and her PhD at the University of Aberdeen. And you can also find her on things like the BBC, where she was a producer and a writer for the BBC. I like to keep looking at her and make sure I'm not getting it all wrong. I'm going to start making some of this up in a minute. I just want to clarify. Okay, so, Isla is now with the working with the Save Our Seas Foundation. She has been for a while. She's also host of some incredible podcasts. Some of you might know The Whole Tooth, which is obviously about sharks. It's no longer The Whole Tooth, which I found out later after introducing her to somebody as the podcast host of that, because it was, as we'll find out about, it was a conflict with the dentist who already had that podcast name. Is now the host of The World of Sharks, which if you haven't listened to it, it's fantastic. Now has a job with Save Our Seas, and it doesn't have a title. But she's somewhat of a science communicator, but like the more advanced version of that. And apparently they are still working on what that title is. So I think later on, after a few more beers, we can all work on what we think Isla's title should be. So with that, I'll hand it over to Isla and let her do 45 minutes of interpretive dance for us. So thank you, Isla.
Thank you, Taylor. I was a bit nervous there. I wasn't quite sure what he was going to say. But
I wasn't sure either.
but we made it. But yeah, thank you so much to Taylor and to Cinnamon for having me. And thank you all for being here. I was told it was acceptable to drink beer while I was talking. So, sláinte, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to listen to what I have to say. And yeah, as Taylor alluded to, I have had a slightly colourful, or shall we say, wonky career. Is that working? Yeah, great. So I kind of wear two main hats now. So one of my hats, as Taylor mentioned, is sharks. So I've done a lot of work with sharks over the years. They came into my life in a really big way in 2019 when I started working with basking sharks. So I was a marine biologist and wildlife guide for a company called Basking Shark Scotland out in the Hebrides, and had the absolute privilege of getting to spend a lot of time in the water with these incredible animals. And also, collecting data, collecting different parts of data for other universities and other researchers. And then that led on to a job with the Save Our Seas Foundation. And I've been so fortunate to get to go and work and help out with research on sharks all over the world, and work with some really incredible people, including Taylor and Alex at the Big Fish Lab. And that's led to me being here, which is also fantastic. But the other hat that I wear is as a marine social scientist. So that is kind of really where my research and academic interests lie. And that means that rather than kind of working and trying to understand the really cool and amazing animals that live and work in our oceans, or live in our oceans, I should say, I actually try to understand our own species. So that's mainly what I'm going to be talking about today, is how important it is to understand our own species for conservation. But there are lots of lovely pictures of sharks and other wildlife throughout this talk, just to, keep you entertained. So hopefully that makes up for it. But what I would really like to talk to you about today is, firstly, why study humans in the context of conservation? Also, what do we mean by the term conservation conflicts, and how can we understand them better? I'm going to be talking all about that in the middle of this talk. And then lastly, I'm going to finish off by talking about some recent work I've been doing back at home in Scotland around marine protected areas, fisheries, and sharks. But before I get into that, I thought a good place to start is where I started. So if I can transport you back to 2011, when I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, I started out life as a marine ecologist. And mainly what I was studying was marine mammals. My supervisor very fondly called me later on a blubber lover, which is a great term. And I mainly tried to understand where these animals went and what they were doing when they got there. And so my master's project was mainly focused around a little species of whale that we get very, very common in the Atlantic, the minke whale. And I was trying to understand where they went around the coast of Scotland and why. No surprise to anyone, it wasn't groundbreaking. I actually found out that they went where the food was. So, but to no one's surprise. But then my next project brought me into the world of seal behaviour. So this is a place called the Eithne Estuary, which is in the northeast coast of Scotland. And it's a huge haul-out site for grey seals. So we have a population here of about 3,000 individuals. And they all haul out on this beach here, hang out in the river mouth, and also head out to sea as well. And the reason that I was brought onto this project is because the Eithne Estuary is also very, very popular with recreational anglers who are fishing for salmon. And there's a bit of a conflict here in the estuary between the seals who are just, hanging out, doing their thing, and the anglers in the Eithne Estuary who believe that the seals were predating on their salmon and reducing the salmon stocks. And so my job was to kind of come on board from an ecologist perspective and monitor the seals' behavior to see if that was actually the case. So what I was doing is I was standing on beaches, watching out for what they were doing. I was looking at the behavior around angling vessels. And I was also doing some scat analysis as well, which is basically looking through their poop and seeing what they were eating. So this is me in the field. So worryingly, not using binoculars to look at what I was looking at. Also using bin bags as waterproofs. So maybe this is a sign that I probably shouldn't have pursued a career in ecology, and I'm probably doing the right thing now. But it was great. I had a great time on the cold, windy beaches of northern Scotland. And we also got to go out with some of the anglers as well and observe the seals' behavior around the boat. And long story short, we found out that the seals were not actually predating on salmon. So we could see no evidence in the behavior that they were taking salmon. Their behavior around the boats was very avoidant. They were kind of avoiding what the anglers were doing. And it seemed more likely that they were heading out to the open ocean to feed rather than predating on the salmon stocks. This was very exciting to me as a young biologist. I thought this is great. I can now go and tell the Angling Society that the seals are not harming their salmon stocks and everything will be great and lovely. And the anglers will not want to have a cull. And also I had read the Conservation Handbook, so I knew that any good scientist should go and do communication to the stakeholders. And so here I went as a naive early 20-year-old, went and stood in a room full of angry anglers and presented my data. And they didn't want, or they didn't agree with what my data had found, and they still called for a cull of the seals. And this, unfortunately, was my first experience as a scientist, my first very humbling experience as a scientist of working with humans and working with our own species. And this was also my first experience of what we call human-wildlife conflict. So you might have heard this term before. It's a bit of a buzzword. It was defined over 20 years ago as situations occurring when an action by either humans or wildlife has an adverse effect on the other. So this means when humans and wildlife come into contact with one another, and that has negative consequences for either humans, wildlife, or both. And one of the situations that we talk about a lot, or we hear about a lot, is depredation. So this is typically when we have a predator, so a large carnivore or a shark or something like that, taking the livestock or the fish of somebody who is very dependent on that for their livelihoods. So we might see it a lot in places like Africa with big cats. We might see it here in the US with wolves and bears. This was my context with the seals in Scotland and the salmon fishermen. And it's also an emerging conflict with sharks. So we're actually seeing cases of depredation more often around the world, where sharks are thought to be taking fish out from fisheries. And because we kind of see these as conflicts between humans and wildlife, the natural way to cope with these conflicts or try and manage these conflicts is to either put space between the humans and the wildlife to try and prevent that negative interaction from happening, or to provide things like compensation. So say you provide some money to a farmer who's lost his livestock to cover the cost of the livestock, or to a fisherman who's lost his fish to a shark or to another marine predator. And I would say this is probably the most commonly used way of conflict management when we talk about human-wildlife conflict around the world, because it makes sense, right? So back when I was starting to, I was very interested in the whole seal conflict in the Either estuary and why my research kind of hadn't worked and how my research hadn't been able to manage that conflict. And so I delved deep into the literature, and I found lots of scientists like me who were investigating human-wildlife conflicts, trying to figure out the best way of resolving them. And I found lots of studies that looked at compensation and found that it actually hadn't worked in a lot of instances. So mainly a lot of the literature that I could find was around sort of large carnivores, especially in Africa and in Europe. And just for example, so places like Italy has been paying out compensation for wolf attacks for decades, but that has resulted in no demonstrable increase in tolerance towards the species amongst farmers. France has also been paying out compensation above the market value for bear attacks in the Pyrenees for years, but farmers also remain violently opposed to the bears. And in Norway, which pays out the highest level of compensation in Europe for livestock loss, there are still regular calls for culls, and predators are only permitted in specially designated zones while poaching continues. And so I started to kind of think maybe there is something else going on here. And when we actually look at the term conflict, so we can see how it's defined, it's usually defined in a couple of different ways. So one is a serious disagreement or an argument, typically a protracted one, a state of mind in which a person experiences a clash of opposing feelings or needs, or a serious incompatibility between two or more opinions, principles, or interests. And this, to me, and this is widely spoken about in the literature, this is the problem with using the term human-wildlife conflict, because I don't know about you, but I have never seen a shark experience a serious incompatibility or have a serious disagreement in its own head about what it should be doing. Conflict is very much a human phenomenon, you know? And around this time was when I was doing a course at university called Understanding Conservation Conflicts. So it was kind of serendipitous timing. And I came across my future PhD supervisor, who I've put in a kind of glorious ring up there. This is Professor Steve Redpath. And Steve came up with the term conservation conflict. And so this is situations that arise when two or more parties have strongly held views over biodiversity objectives, and one of those parties is attempting to assert its interests at the expense of the other. So it sees conflict as fundamentally something that is very human. It's between two groups of humans that have contrasting views or ideas or objectives, typically around conservation. And it sort of takes away from that focus on wildlife. And so what Steve and his colleagues were suggesting was that we should separate the kind of human-wildlife interactions from the term conflict and see conflict as something that is fundamentally between humans. And this kind of made a lot of sense to me, and I'm sure it makes a lot of sense to people who have worked in the field of conservation, who have worked in ecology and sciences where you're working with people a lot. We come up against this time and time again, where you have people with different interests, who have different beliefs over what should be done, how wildlife should be managed. And typically it escalates into something very complicated very quickly. The problem is that our own species is incredibly complicated. So we tend to be very messy, we tend to react to things in a very emotional way and not a very logical way. And that makes these situations particularly difficult and differently protracted to try and understand. And so this is the kind of conclusion that I came to when I entered into my PhD. And reading around the subject, I came to understand that, you know, understanding our own species requires more tools in our toolbox. So that includes different fields like the social sciences, so that can help us understand why humans behave in a certain way. Also the political sciences, so what are the structures, what are the structural issues that cause things like social inequities, cause people to respond to conflicts in a certain way. And also particularly if we're talking about conflicts, there's a whole field called peace studies, which looks into the dynamics of conflict and why sometimes they escalate, de-escalate, things like that. And we're going to get all into that because this is what I decided I was going to study for my PhD. So I became really interested in these dynamics. So conservation conflicts, what are they all about? And how can we apply techniques and methods that we use in these fields to conservation? And at the time, this was around 2013, 2014, this was quite a new field. Like, no one was really doing this apart from Steve. And so Steve naturally became my PhD supervisor. So if you'll indulge me, we're going to dive into conflicts. And I wanted to dive into some of the things and some of the models that I came across during my PhD that I mainly drew from peace studies. And so this is the levels of conflict model. So this was first, the Canadian Institute of Conflict Resolution first came up with this in 2000. And then Madden and McQuinn adapted this to a conservation context later in 2014. And what it shows is the three different levels of conflict. So what we have at the top there, we have our surface dispute. Underneath that, we have underlying conflict, and then we have our deeper rooted identity-based conflict. And so I'm going to go into each of these levels in a bit more detail. But essentially what it's saying is that these situations are often kind of not what they seem to be. So first of all, we have our surface dispute. So this is essentially kind of what the visible and obvious manifestation of the conflict is. It's usually a material issue. So typically the example that you might use is if you have a spouse or a housemate, they've not done the dishes. It's a bit annoying, it's not the end of the world. And you can usually resolve this by talking it through or by a settlement. So when we talk about wildlife conflicts, this would kind of be our initial argument over the impact of a species or over how conservation is being done, something like that. But then as we kind of escalate things a little bit, we get into our underlying conflict. So this is usually when we have surface disputes that haven't been resolved and they keep happening repeatedly. So now there's a history. So past interactions or the decisions that someone have made kind of intensify or aggravate the situation. So if we go back to our analogy of you being in your house with your housemate or your spouse, they've not done the dishes for like the last 7 days. So now it's even more annoying, right? So now we have an escalation. And then we come into our identity-based or deeper-rooted conflicts. I do know that orca are actually dolphins and not whales, but that was the joke. But yeah, so our identity-based or deep-rooted conflicts. Now we're kind of into something that isn't really about what the initial argument was about at all. So we're into more non-material issues. So these are things like clashing values, beliefs, or the unmet needs of the involved parties. And now we're talking about kind of really deeper rooted structural causes, so systemic, societal, and political issues. So if we kind of think about our kitchen again, this is kind of going back to long history or like feeling like, for example, I have to fulfill this certain role and I'm not comfortable with that, that sort of thing. Or it becomes more about what that person is about and what they stand for, rather than what that surface dispute is. And the problem is that each of these different levels have different ways that they need to be approached in order to be resolved or managed. So like I said, our surface dispute there, we can kind of settle that pretty easily. You can maybe talk about it, move on, and if you know, that other party kind of resolves that issue, then great, we can all move on with our lives. But quite often that doesn't happen. Underlying conflict needs kind of more deeper reconciliation and resolution. So now we're talking about bringing people into a room together, you know, having very deeper discussions. And then to kind of address these deep-rooted identity-based conflicts, we're talking about much longer term, much more intense processes, so more transformational processes. So addressing those deeper-rooted issues or, you know, structures that are causing this deeper-rooted identity-based conflict. And that is extremely difficult and often takes a long time. And when we're talking about conservation, so if we put this back into our conservation context, when we talk about human-wildlife conflict and we bring in things like compensation, or we might bring in fencing to separate the humans and wildlife, we're very much talking about this top level here. So we're talking about settlement. The problem is that if we do that without then addressing any underlying conflict or any deeper-rooted conflict, we're not going to get very far. And so if we kind of go back to that example of the seals and the anglers, I believe that's what was happening, and that there were some underlying conflicts or deeper-rooted identity-based conflicts that weren't being addressed. And when we aren't addressing these kind of two deeper levels, this is what causes conflicts to escalate and get to a point where they become so entrenched that we can't come back from them. And this is actually, to sound really nerdy, this is actually one of my favorite models from political studies, simply because of the names of the stages. So as you'll notice, this is the Stages of Conflict Escalation model by Frederick Glassell, which was developed in 1999. And as you'll see, the stages of conflict escalation go down. And this is because we're kind of going down together into the abyss, which sounds very dramatic, but I'll get to that in a second. So we have our first three stages here. So this is almost like our surface dispute. So we have the initial tension, the initial argument, and then that kind of escalates a little bit into a debate. And then we have like actions instead of words. So you might be really passive aggressive and, you know, slamming the cupboard doors around or something like that. But even here, because we're still in our dispute stage, we're kind of in an easy, we can come back from this, right? We can try and talk it through. Maybe we'll be able to resolve this with, you know, certain, like I said, with our compensation or, you know, something like that, and bring that conflict back. But if not, then we start to escalate a little bit further. So we start to get coalitions forming between different groups of people who share the same opinion. Then we start to get kind of loss of face. So what that means is you're start to get a bit more concerned about being embarrassed by the other person. And then we kind of go into threat strategies. So if you don't do this, then I'm going to do this. And we're starting to get a little bit more serious and a little bit more entrenched. And we can still come back from this. So this is like our kind of underlying conflict, if you like. But it's going to be harder. We're going to require more discussions, more negotiation, and more effort to kind of get past this stage. And then we come into the final stage, which, I mean, this comes from peace studies, right? So this is the stage where you've forgotten what this initial debate was about, and you're all about just taking the other side down. So we have very fun names here, which is limited destruction, total annihilation, and then together into the abyss. So this suggests that this is a bad place. We don't want to get here, right? And this is kind of a really lose-lose situation. And this is where it becomes very, very, very difficult to manage that conflict. And this all sounds very dramatic, but we do get conflicts that reach that stage in the context of conservation. So I want to talk about one today. So this is actually what I focused on for my PhD. So I won't go into too much detail about this case study, but basically in Scotland we have a form of land management which is to maintain the land for grouse shooting, so game birds, and part of that is the removal of predators. And so this has been a conflict that has been going on since 1954, because in 1954 in Scotland it was made illegal to kill or hunt a bird of prey, so a raptor. We have several different species of bird of prey in Scotland. You know, we have golden eagles, sea eagles, buzzards, red kites. And all of these species have almost been driven to the brink of extinction because of this form of land management. And because it's been going on for such a long time and it hasn't really been resolved, this conflict is about here. So we have people being pulled out of their cars and beaten up because of what they believe in. We have certain land managers' kids being beaten up in school because their dads want, further conservation for birds of prey. And so kind of we're all the way down here. And so for my PhD, I kind of wanted to study this very entrenched and very deep-rooted conflict, and basically try and find out why people were acting, how people were responding to this situation, and how they were responding to it and why. And so what I did is I went away and did some training in qualitative research methods, so social science research methods. And I went out and I conducted interviews with people from all different sides of this conflict. So land managers, landowners, the gamekeepers, who were the people who were committing the crimes, also raptor conservationists, so the people who are trying to conserve the birds of prey, and conducted interviews for about 2 years, reviewed all of these interviews, analysed them all, and then tried to see if there were any similarities between the different sides and how they were behaving. And the answer was yes. So that regardless of what side people were on, there were 3 main responses to the conflict. So the first one was the acceptance response. So this is the one that we all want. This is, we all have a role here. We could all do better. But I think you know what I'm going to say here. This was an extremely rare response in my data set. So I think I only had about 5 out of 40 people who had this response to the conflict. The majority of people fell into 2 camps. So the first one was our resistance camp. So this was people who felt extremely confrontational and very argumentative. And the interesting thing is that these were the people who were going into, I should have said this before, but this conflict is, people have been trying to resolve this conflict for decades, and we've had several attempts to bring people into a room together and get them to talk and hash it out. I was in some of these meetings, and there were grown men who were banging their fists on the table, kicking chairs over. It was very intense. So these are the people who will go into those meetings because they feel that they need to fight their corner. They want to argue, and they're not there with the interest of kind of finding shared ground and a shared solution. And then we also had the people who had this kind of more despondent response. So this is feeling like there's no point in engaging because I'm just going to get shouted down. I may as well just not engage at all. And so we called this kind of the fight or flight response. So the resistant people were kind of the flight, and the despondent people were the resistant people were the fight, and the despondent people were the flight. You'll have to excuse my jet lag a little bit here. So yeah, we had these kind of 2 main camps, and my question was, what was it that was causing people to react in these ways? And so this is one of the papers from my PhD. It looks very complicated, but I'll talk you through it. So we have our kind of acceptance people on this side here. So these are the people who kind of are willing to make an effort to resolve the conflict. They think everybody has a role to share. And then on the other side, we have our flight or flight responses. And the interesting thing was there were the same kind of building blocks in why people would respond in a certain way, but just tweaked slightly differently. And there were similarities between the despondent camp and between the resistant camp. So here on the far-hand side there, people would either back away from the conflict or they would go in and be antagonistic if they felt that they had very little power or agency in the process. If they felt that either blame was being assigned unfairly to them, or they felt that the wrong party was being held accountable. If they felt that they weren't well represented on kind of like a national level, so no one can speak for me, they had very, very little trust in decision makers and in the process as a whole, and very little trust in the government or the authorities who are in charge of the process. And the factors that went into these two reactions were very, very similar, but they resulted in different responses. And neither of these are what we want when we're trying to kind of resolve or manage these kind of situations. We want someone who is going to be cooperative and engage properly. And so for someone to engage properly, they had to feel the opposite. So rather than feeling like they were on the back foot and no one represented them, they had to feel like everybody had an equal power in the process. They had to feel like accountability was fairly spread. They also had to feel like they had a strong representative for their beliefs and their interests, and have high trust in other people in the process and the government. And I think you can all agree that this is something that is very, very fundamentally human, regardless of the context that we're working at. And so I came to understand conflicts or conservation conflicts as an iceberg. So the visible part, the little part that we can see that people often talk about and express, that is the surface dispute. So that is our dispute around species impact or, clashing interests. But then what we don't see and what is much harder to tease out and to understand is all the stuff that is lying underneath the surface. And this includes things like different cultures, clashing traditions, power dynamics, poor governance mechanisms, past relationships, poor trust. All of these things kind of lie underneath the surface and make this so much more difficult to navigate. So I often say, imagine you're in a ship. This little bit at the surface, we can see that and we can try and navigate that, but it's the stuff that's underneath that we can't see that's going to sink the ship. And this is the stuff that we need to be focusing on and understand if we want to improve sustainability and effectiveness of our conservation measures. And so now I'm going to take us back to the ocean, because the same things, we see the same things. So that was mainly on a terrestrial standpoint, but we see the same things also in the marine space as well. So this is a paper that was published in 2019, and it looked at all different types of conservation projects around the world and especially in the marine environment, and found that human dimensions are the most common causes of project failure. And with that in mind, I now wanted to take you back to my home country of Scotland and talk about a fellowship that I've been doing for the last 3 years. So this has been focused on marine protected areas, fisheries and sharks in Scotland. And I hope this will illustrate some of the points that I've been talking about. So for those of you who haven't been to Scotland, it's beautiful. Please come. I think you'll like it there. And our seas, we are an ocean nation. So our seas represent 2/3 of the entire UK exclusive economic zone, and they are hugely biodiverse. So a lot of people think people probably think the similar things about here, but because we get a lot of wind and a lot of rain, people think our seas are really boring and lifeless. They're not. We have about 6,500 species of animals and plants, and that includes sharks and some very threatened species of sharks as well. So we're actually a global hotspot for the second largest species of shark in the world, the basking shark. They were historically fished in Scotland for their big oily livers, but the last fishery closed in 1997, which is actually pretty recent. I was pretty shocked to learn that. And they are now a protected species, so those fisheries are no more. And we think the populations are starting to recover. And we often see large aggregations of basking sharks over summer, mainly on the west coast of Scotland. We also have a critically endangered species of skate, the flapper skate. These are the largest species of skate in Europe. They're huge. We often call them the barn door skate because their wingspan is so massive. These are not commercially fished, but they are very popular with recreational anglers. So we do have a lot of sport angling kind of around our west coast. We also have this little cutie here, the spiny dogfish, or spur dog, as we call them in Scotland. The fishery was closed for the last 5 years to allow the population to recover. And because of that, a commercial fishery has now recently opened again. So these guys are commercially fished. We also have the porbeagle as well, which is kind of like a mini great white, if you like. and they are also kind of popular with recreational anglers. And we have so many other species of shark and ray. These are just some of them. But the point I'm trying to make here is that we don't have much in the way of commercial fisheries for sharks and rays in Scotland, so there's not kind of really a conflict in that sense. And our fishing fleet is actually quite unique. So it's largely made up of small-scale vessels, so that's 10 metres or under. They dominate the Scottish fishing fleet, and they're largely inshore vessels, and family-owned as well, so very much small-scale. So the vast majority of boats go out from the same harbour every single day, go out for the day and come back. And they're largely fishing, the majority of our fisheries are pot fishing. So that's putting pots down for things like crab and lobster. And we do have a very, very small sector for trawling, mainly for nephrops, for a type of prawn. But the vast majority of our fleet is small-scale local boats that are fishing with pots. And so we don't see a lot in the way of kind of bycatch or anything like that, but we do know that there are some impacts on sharks and rays around our coastlines. The main one being entanglement. So this is actually a picture from Ireland. This isn't from Scotland, but we know that it also happens in Scotland as well. So basking sharks typically get entangled in the lines to the pots, in the ground lines. And a recent study that was carried out in 2021 found that basking sharks are among the most frequently entangled species in Scottish waters. They very rarely wash up on shore like this, so a lot of the data that we have actually comes from reports from fishermen themselves. But it was found that 46 of 146 reported cases were of basking sharks, but there must be many more that we don't actually know about that have been lost to sea. So entanglement is an issue. And then when we're thinking of flapper skate, we do have some bycatch, especially in our trawling fleet as well. And also flapper skate are an egg-laying species. So they typically lay their eggs on, the rocky seabeds where they can tuck the eggs underneath big rocks on the seafloor. These eggs are massive. They're like the same size as your head. But they are also, very sensitive habitats. So if you have a trawler go through there, or even if you have a fisherman put pots down and drag that across the seafloor, that can obviously have impacts on these nursery grounds. And to protect our biodiversity, Scotland does have quite an extensive marine protected area network. So we have around 233 sites that are designated specifically for nature conservation. And they cover 37% of Scottish, our exclusive economic zone. The issue with this is that Scotland likes to say that we've already smashed our 30 by 30 target, but a lot of these are largely paper parks. So actually, trawling and dredging is still allowed in about 60% of our marine protected areas. And also pot fishing is allowed in the vast majority of them. We have very little in the way of fisheries management within our MPAs. And also the way we do it is slightly unusual. So we have things called priority marine features or specific species or habitats that are the marine protected area is designated for. And so we have 3 that are designated for sharks, rays and skates. One is the Sea of the Hebrides that is designated for the basking shark. The Loch Sunat to the Sound of Jura is designated for flapper skate, and then we have a much smaller one called Red Rocks and Longay that is designated to protect a specific nursery site for the flapper skate. So only 3 out of those 233 marine protected areas are specifically for sharks, rays or skates, and fishing activity is allowed in 2 of them. So Sea of the Hebrides and Loch Sunat, fishing is still allowed. Red Rocks and Longay fishing has is completely prohibited, and I'll get to that in a little bit. And so Scottish Government have been really heavily criticised in the last couple of years for not having enough conservation measures within their MPAs and not having enough specifically fisheries management measures within their marine protected areas. And so in response, Scottish Government said that they were going to designate 10% of these marine protected areas as highly protected marine areas, which would be effectively no-take zones. And if I'm going to sum up the reaction to this, it would kind of look a bit like this. So our fishing industry and coastal communities reacted very, very negatively to this. So Scottish Government put out a public consultation, 4,000 people responded, and the responses were pretty stark. So 76% were opposed to the highly protected marine areas, and only 20% of people supported it, or respondents supported the initiative. And the main reason for this was the impact on the highland and island communities and inshore fisheries. So a lot of our, we have basically like 3 cities in Scotland that are all concentrated at the bottom. The rest of our land is all coastal or highland communities that are highly dependent on these inshore fisheries for their livelihoods and for their culture as well. And so, you know, we had so many of these communities concerned that this was going to have a severe impact on the economy of those communities. And it was all over the news. There were people posting about it on social media. This is a really great Scottish band. If any of you are into Scottish trad music, please check out Skippinish. But they did a song which was basically about this initiative called The Clearances Again, which was comparing the highly protected marine areas to the Highland clearances, which was when thousands of people were forcibly evicted from their homes, you know, back in the 1800s. So there was definitely a sense of a feeling of unfairness and injustice in this. And this song went to #1 on the Scottish iTunes chart when this came out. So it was a pretty strong response. And at the time, I was running, you know, a much larger project that was looking at fishermen's perspectives of marine protection in general. And I was super interested in this and really interested in this response. And I kind of wanted to break it down a little bit. And so I traveled around Scotland for 2.5 years, conducting in-depth interviews with fishermen around the country. So I spoke to 60 people, did recorded interviews with 60 people, but I had many more conversations, many more informal conversations, just sitting on boats over cups of tea, in community halls. And I also conducted a number of workshops as well. And I was really interested to see, you know, what people's perspectives were of, you know, sharks raising skates, but also if there was any sort of underlying issues that was causing them to sort of react in this way. And so the overall perspectives of elasmobranchs, so a lot of fishermen reported that they had noticed changes in the distribution and abundance of sharks and skates, so that includes basking sharks. So basking sharks, a lot of fishermen felt that they had seen numbers or the abundance of basking sharks drop in recent years, and they were very concerned about this. They wanted to know why. Flapper skate and dogfish, they felt had increased, and they often referred to them as kind of maybe pest species, or they were a bit more neutral towards them. Basking sharks they loved, flapper skate and dogfish not so much. But the fishermen did acknowledge that inshore fisheries in Scotland can have impacts on these species. So the main ones were boat strikes, so that's particularly for basking shark, entanglement in their lines. So some fishermen talked about basking sharks being entangled, or flapper skate, or larger species, and also bycatch as well. But the thing that was most worrying to me and most concerning to me was the fact that fishers were reporting or saying that they were worried to talk about this. They were worried to talk about what they were seeing at sea. They were worried to report sightings of sharks or rays, because they felt that that would result in some sort of closure of their fishery. And they didn't trust the government to sort of take their concerns seriously. And we even had reports of fishermen having things like flapper skate, catching things like flapper skate in their fisheries, in their lines, and then just killing them because they didn't want people to find out that that was happening. And this is very worrying to me because, you know, a lot of sharks and rays, we rely on fishermen, we rely on the people that work on the seas to provide data on these animals, because it's so hard for us to find them. And to get data on them and to be out there ourselves. And so we're relying on fisheries to provide that data for us. And if they're withholding that information because they're too scared to pass on that data, then that's not a great position to be in. And so I kind of wanted to really understand why they had this perspective. And some of the things that I was looking at was different elements of how marine protected areas had been implemented in the past and how they had been managed, and fishermen's perspectives of that. And so again, this looks pretty complicated, but it's pretty simple to understand. So on this side here, we have different elements of implementation, so things like governance, accountability, effectiveness, transparency in the process, how well things are being communicated. Green is fishers talked about this positively. Yellow is they talked about it neutrally, and red is they talked about it negatively. And as you can see, all of these factors are very much skewed towards the red. So our fishermen had major issues in how marine protected areas had been implemented, managed, and governed. So 93.3% felt that decisions had been made without adequate involvement of fishers. 68% felt that their knowledge had been underutilized and their experiences hadn't really been heard or used. 58% felt that communication and transparency around marine protected areas was severely lacking, so they kind of didn't really have information about what was happening and why. And this resulted in about 88% of my interviewees saying that they had little to no trust in decision makers. And this was making them hugely nervous of sending through data or participating in conservation initiatives because of all of these factors combined. And I said I was going to go back to one of the marine protected areas. There was one marine protected area that was cited in particular when fishers were talking about these issues, and that was the Red Rocks and Long Marine Protected Area. So this is a relatively small site, so only 12.55 square kilometres, that was designated to protect a nursery site for the egg-laying species, the flapper skate. So this is actually the site here. These are some divers looking at, this is the egg case that you can see at the bottom. And it was actually designated as an emergency MPA, so the first one that Scottish Government has ever designated as an emergency, because scallop divers who were hand diving for scallops found the eggs when they were diving down there, and they got together with the pot fishermen and flagged this up to the government and said, hey, there's a site here where there's tons and tons of egg cases, there's hundreds of egg cases in a very small area, and we think this should be protected. And so this got put in place because of lobbying by fishermen, by divers, because they wanted to protect the site against trawling and dredging. Instead, what happened is the trawlers and dredgers said, we will not use that site, but only if the pot fishermen and the hand divers are also banned from that site as well. And so the area was closed to all fishing with immediate effect. And to this day, it hasn't been revoked. So there hasn't been any process to kind of review that. People have not been allowed to fish in the area. Even the fishers who found the site in the first place have not been allowed to go back to that site. And this is the example that all the fishermen go to when they talk about saying, oh, I found flapper skate here, or oh, I've seen basking sharks here, because they think that the same thing is going to happen. That fishing ground is going to be taken away from them without kind of any consultation. And then, you know, that'll result in them losing that fishing ground, and that'll be it. There will be no monitoring and no discussion after that point. And that, combined with how other MPAs have been put into place, is making them feel very much on the back foot. And so we're starting to see all those kind of very familiar threads coming back through. And so I worked very closely with a graphic designer, and we also worked very closely with the government agencies to try and get these perspectives across, and suggest some kind of management strategies that might work on those more deeper rooted issues, those feelings of a lack of trust, of lack of transparency, communication, poor governance mechanisms, to try and make this situation better. So we're kind of really working on building the foundations there so that when we have those surface disputes in the future, we can move past them in a more kind of effective way. And so we suggested things like a focus on co-design and collaboration, so fishers felt more involved in the process right from the get-go. improved communication, but not just at the beginning, so throughout the whole process, so that they knew exactly what was happening and when. And also monitoring, keeping a framework for monitoring and evaluation. So something that we heard across all the marine protected areas, not just the ones for sharks and rays, was that there was a huge lack of understanding what the benefits of putting the MPA in place was, and any negative impacts as well, and that fishers weren't being involved in that, or weren't hearing about that, or that it didn't exist at all. And so they're very, very reluctant to agree to a future designation. And so I've just thrown a lot of information at you. So in summary, for us to have effective and sustainable conservation initiatives, so not just of sharks, but of wildlife and species around the world, we need to understand our own species, understand why we react in certain ways, why we respond to certain conservation initiatives in certain ways, and kind of really understand those more complex, deeper-rooted issues. But for that, we need expertise from the social and political sciences, as well as our ecology, as well as our biology. It's so, so, so important to factor that in, and for those fields to be integrated. Process really matters, so it really, really matters how we do things, because if we do something in a slightly less effective, or we do something slightly less well, or in an unfair way, people are going to remember that. And so the next time you try and do something, they're going to respond based on that past experience. So it really matters how we do things, not just the why, and who is involved. And it's always going to be complicated. Working with people is difficult. Like I said at the beginning, we don't act in a way that is logical. We act based on emotion. But we can manage conflicts. Conflicts are a natural part of human nature. We're going to disagree with each other. But if we have those good foundations there, those good, good governance, tackle those deeper-rooted issues, and we manage it with the right expertise, understanding, and approach, we can move past them in a more effective way. So that's everything I had to say to you. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for listening to me talk about my research. And the one thing I wanted to leave you with is that sharks are really cool. And, I think much better than humans. So if you would like to get in touch, please feel free to do so. And also, shameless plug for our podcast with the Save Our Seas Foundation, which is the World of Sharks podcast. We have a great time over there, and we talk all about fun things to do with sharks. So yeah, thank you so much for having me, and yeah, welcome any questions.
Thank you so very much. Much appreciated. I want to open it up to questions, but I also understand that we're kind of against our time limit. So if you feel like you need to step out, there's 2 exit doors in the back. I feel like I'm playing 2 exit doors in the back that you're welcome to exit out. Right, there we go. But other than that, I would like to open up to questions. I want to start with questions online. I can see Roseanne has one already. Go ahead, Roseanne.
A great talk. I'm looking forward to connecting later this week. There are a lot of similarities here between your context and that of the Oregon Marine Reserves. What have the reactions been sharing this info with MPA managers in Scotland?
It's a very good question. Mainly because I finished the fellowship back in November, so it's very recent, and I did give a presentation to our government agencies that are in charge of the implementation and designation of marine protected areas. The reception was good, so a lot of these issues they are very aware of and just didn't really know how to approach it. And so they've actually created a whole new position within our kind of nature conservation agency, which is called Nature Scot, specifically for someone who will be in charge of the communication and engagement with fisheries and designing sustainable strategies for that. So that was really positive to hear that. That kind of came out of that report because they realized that that was a problem area. And in terms of like the coastal communities, and especially the fishing community, I think they were very responsive and very positive towards the findings of the report. I think they just wanted to they liked the fact that their point was getting across and their voices were being heard. And so, yeah, it's kind of like we'll wait and see what the response is going to be. So we have an election coming up this May. So we'll see who comes into power next, and what they're what they want us to, where they want us to go with things. But at the moment, the goal is to improve measures for fisheries in our inshore MPAs. So it's kind of a case of time will tell. But yeah, the response was overwhelmingly positive. So I was very happy about that.
Nice.
Thanks.
All right, question in the room. Okay, 1 second.
Thanks a lot for this. So we're a settler colonial nation. I've lived in Scotland. I think the dynamics that we have here with the indigenous people goes deeper. It's much more spiritual. It's not just cultural. So the salmon is the Eucharist for many of the tribes. And so it's kind of trickier here because we are in a culture that's a dominant culture, white language. English is a language of domination. And so when you're working with tribes, it's a different approach that we have. And so I was wondering if you've ever thought about, taking this to a larger area of the United States where tribes have just been ripped off. Every treaty has been broken with the tribes. All their rivers that they were supposed to have as traditional fishing and Eucharist rivers. Their churches have been decimated not just by dams, but by this settler colonial kind of mindset of domination.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, you're totally right. We don't have that additional element in Scotland. I mean, it is there ever so slightly, but more from like the cultural aspect. So I have mainly focused on the Scottish context. So, I obviously can't speak for here, but I do know there are some fantastic researchers who are looking into conflicts, particularly to do with Indigenous communities. And the kind of general advice is that conflict management is very respectful of that local context and of specifically how those communities manage conflicts within those communities, and making sure that that's built into any kind of plan that that we have to approach conflicts within that area.
Sometimes it's night and day.
Yeah, and that's why it's so tricky. Yeah, but yeah, I don't know enough about that context to speak on it fully, but I do know there are some fantastic researchers who are working in that area specifically. Yeah.
Okay, other questions in the room? Oh, you're going to make me run for it. For folks online, I'm going to have to go to the top of the stairs.
Thank you. Fascinating talk. I think we will have a lot of fun discussions. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to ask one. To take the MPAs just as an example, I understand the species or species group conflicts are continuous, but taking MPAs as a general example, do you think it's better to have more paper protection or fewer, less highly protected areas or highly protected species or species group, and then we build on the systemic feedback loop of this conservation conflict so that we have a positive start that is smaller and then build on that? Or just what's your thought on that? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very, very good question. Because one of the tricky things about the area that I work in, right, is that this kind of stuff often takes a long time and often takes a lot of resources. And when we think about kind of the crises facing our natural world and particularly our oceans, we are running out of time to address that. So it's always kind of trying to balance, doing things right and doing things in the correct way with also what we need to do to address some of those issues. I mean, my preference would always be to have quality over quantity, right? So make sure that we're having a few MPAs, implementing those and making sure that we're at least setting a kind of mechanism for adaptive management and getting that really in place and getting that implemented correctly, and then broadening that out. but I also understand that quite often it can't happen that way simply because of the necessity. And I also think as well that marine protected areas, they are not a silver bullet for everything. You know, particularly when we're talking about mobile species who move in and out of areas, we need kind of other tools in our toolbox. But a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about here, that kind of crosses over a lot of different contexts. So, you know, even if we're talking about fisheries management, we're still having to work with the fisheries for that too. So a lot of this stuff applies. So yeah, that is the challenge, is trying to figure out how we can do this stuff alongside addressing those very pressing and urgent issues as well. Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure I have an answer for you.
All right, any last questions in the room? All right, second Bob.
Yeah, historically, it isn't management and scientists that have, you know, caused the collapse of fisheries. Do you understand? Do you have an understanding from talking to fishermen that they understand who the real enemy is?
Conflict in the room.
It's a difficult conversation to have, that's for sure. It really depends on who you're speaking to. So some fishermen acknowledge that the seas have been fished unsustainably. Particularly in Scotland, I'm speaking to pot fishers, and that's very interesting because they seem to think that their style of fishing is more sustainable and think other forms of fishing are unsustainable. So it's a very interesting dynamic, and some of them also don't want to admit that there are issues there because they are also worried about how that will come across and whether that will result in additional measures that kind of come down on their industry. So a lot of people, when you ask them that question, keep their cards very close to their chest. What I found very interesting, especially about the entanglement issue, is that it's always, you know, I've heard about it happening elsewhere, or I've seen it happen in another fishery. It's never mine. So yeah, it really varies. It really depends who you're speaking to, and mainly because I work with, you know, small scale inshore fishers. They tend to look at the larger scale vessels. So, you know, the larger scale kind of trawlers, longliners. Especially, we have an issue in Scotland with a lot of foreign vessels kind of coming into our inshore waters. So they see that as unsustainable and they think that is a problem. But it really varies between the inshore fishers themselves as to whether they think there is an issue.
All right, I think we're going to wrap it up there, but I want to give you 1 second to just tell us when we walk out of the room, what do you want to have us leave with? You get the last word.
Oh my gosh.
No pressure.
This side of things, like I said, is very complicated, and you know, it's all part of our human nature, really, to disagree and to kind of enter into conflicts with one another. But we really need to get a handle on it and how we approach it, because this is the thing that throws the spanner in the works and slows us down on progress, you know, with conservation objectives, with all the things we need to do to protect our natural environment. So yeah, we need to address that side of things too.
Perfect. With that, everybody, one more round of applause for Isla.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. We'll let you off the hook so you can recover before tomorrow. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you again next month.